A colonial barn in 1741, flames licking at weathered wood, while iron chains rattle against the door from the inside. The screams aren't coming from a slave this time. They're coming from the master and the man holding the key. He's been planning this moment for 7 long, brutal years. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of rebellion. It's the methodical unraveling of a psychological chess game where the pieces were human lives and the board was soaked in blood. The slave didn't just snap, he calculated every move with the precision of a master strategist. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we dare to excavate the stories history tried to bury. This isn't for the faint of heart. This is for those brave enough to stare into the abyss of human nature and ask the hard questions. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened when the powerless seized ultimate power? Subscribe now. Comment your location below, and join our investigation into the darkest corners of colonial America. Colonial New York, 1734. The Hudson Valley stretches like a green tapestry beneath summer skies, but don't let the pastoral beauty fool you. I want you to picture this world, one where human beings are bought and sold like livestock, where the crack of whips mingles with morning birdsong, where the screams from plantation barns are as common as church bells on Sunday. The air itself seems thick with suffering, hanging over the sprawling estates like a perpetual fog. This was a society built on a foundation of systematic brutality, where white colonists convinced themselves that enslaved Africans weren't fully human, a convenient lie that justified unimaginable cruelty. The Dutch patroon system had given way to English colonial rule, but the appetite for human bondage only grew stronger. Wealthy landowners like Jacobus Van Der Berg ruled their domains like medieval kings. Their word was absolute law, their cruelty unlimited by any moral authority. The legal system offered no protection for the enslaved. They had no rights, no recourse, no hope of justice. In this world, a slave who raised his hand against his master faced immediate execution, their body displayed as a warning to others who might dare dream of freedom. Yet in this seemingly hopeless landscape, one man was quietly planning the most audacious act of revenge in colonial history. Now, you have to understand, Jacobus Van Der Berg wasn't some cartoon villain. To his fellow colonists, he was a pillar of the community, a successful merchant and landowner who attended church every Sunday and donated generously to local charities. Picture a man in his 50s, well-dressed in fine wool coats, speaking eloquently about moral virtue while sipping tea in his parlor. His neighbors respected him, his business partners trusted him, and visiting clergy praised his Christian devotion. But behind closed doors, Van Der Berg harbored appetites that would make demons recoil in horror. His plantation wasn't just a place of forced labor, it was his personal torture chamber, a kingdom where he could indulge his darkest impulses without consequence. The man had a particular fondness for psychological torment, understanding that breaking a person's spirit was far more satisfying than merely breaking their body. He would separate families deliberately, forcing parents to watch their children suffer, wives to witness their husbands' humiliation. Van Der Berg kept meticulous records of his punishments, documenting each act of cruelty like a scientist studying specimens. His overseer, Willem Hendricks, was cut from the same cloth, a sadist who found genuine pleasure in others' pain, who would laugh while applying the lash. Together, they created a system of terror so complete that most slaves would rather risk death in an escape attempt than endure another day under their rule. To the outside world, the Van Der Berg plantation was a model of efficiency and order. Jacobus cultivated the image of a benevolent master who treated his servants with Christian kindness, a carefully crafted lie that he sold to everyone, including himself. He would tell visitors how he provided his slaves with adequate housing, regular meals, and even basic medical care when they fell ill. "I treat them like family," he would say with practiced sincerity, gesturing toward the neat rows of slave quarters that looked respectable from a distance. Church records show him donating money for the spiritual education of enslaved people, and he was known to allow them time off for religious observances. Local newspapers occasionally featured glowing profiles of his progressive approach to plantation management. praising his ability to maintain productivity without resorting to excessive punishment. Van der Berg was a master manipulator who understood that perception was everything. He needed his neighbors to see him as a righteous man, partly to maintain his social standing, but mostly to ensure no one would ever think to investigate what really happened on his property after dark. The few times concerned citizens asked about unusual sounds coming from his land, he had ready explanations: construction work, livestock troubles, or disciplinary actions necessary to maintain order. He even invited local clergy to visit during carefully orchestrated tours, showing them well-fed slaves performing light duties while the real horrors remained hidden behind locked barn doors. Let's be real. Van der Berg's plantation was designed like a medieval fortress, with the barn serving as his private dungeon. This wasn't your typical agricultural building. It was a purpose-built chamber of horrors located far enough from the main house to muffle screams, yet close enough for Van der Berg to visit whenever his sadistic urges demanded satisfaction. The structure itself was reinforced with extra thick walls and specially installed soundproofing materials, layers of hay and cloth that absorbed the sounds of suffering. Inside, you'd find an arsenal of torture devices that would make Spanish inquisitors envious. Iron shackles bolted into the walls, pulley systems for suspension punishments, and branding irons kept perpetually hot in a corner forge. Van der Berg had invested considerable money in creating the perfect environment for prolonged torture, complete with drainage systems to wash away blood and a ventilation system that prevented his victims from suffocating too quickly. The barn's location was strategically chosen, hidden from public roads by dense woods, accessible only through private paths that Van der Berg controlled completely. He had even installed a bell system that allowed him to summon slaves to the barn without alerting others to what was happening. The building's innocent exterior, weathered wood, and a traditional gambrel roof masked the sophisticated infrastructure of cruelty within. This wasn't impulsive violence. It was industrial-scale sadism, designed and implemented with the same careful planning that Van der Berg applied to his legitimate business ventures. When neighbors occasionally heard disturbing sounds or noticed unexplained injuries on Van der Berg's slaves, there were always perfectly reasonable explanations ready at hand. Agricultural accidents were common, after all. People got hurt working with heavy machinery, dangerous tools, and unpredictable livestock. Van der Berg had cultivated relationships with local officials and a sympathetic doctor who would dutifully document injuries as workplace mishaps without asking uncomfortable questions. When slaves appeared with suspicious wounds or behavioral changes, the official narrative blamed their naturally violent temperament or their inability to safely handle farm equipment. The colonial mindset was already primed to accept these explanations. Most whites believed that Africans were inherently clumsy, violent, and prone to self-inflicted injuries. Van der Berg exploited these racist assumptions masterfully, knowing that society was eager to believe any story that didn't implicate a respected white landowner. Local authorities had no interest in investigating claims of excessive punishment, especially when they came from enslaved people whose testimony wasn't legally admissible anyway. The few times concerned citizens pressed for answers, Van der Berg would invite them for dinner, charm them with his hospitality, and produce carefully coached slaves who would praise their master's kindness. He understood that people wanted to believe in his innocence because the alternative, that a pillar of their community was a monster, was too disturbing to contemplate. This willful blindness created the perfect cover for his crimes, allowing him to operate with complete impunity for years. Now, you have to understand that Van der Berg couldn't orchestrate this level of systematic cruelty entirely alone. He needed someone who shared his appetites and could be trusted with his darkest secrets. Enter Willem Hendricks, the plantation's overseer and Van der Berg's partner in sadism. Hendricks was a man who had been shaped by violence from childhood, having grown up in a household where brutal punishment was considered normal discipline. Unlike Van der Berg, who maintained a facade of respectability, Hendricks made no effort to hide his cruel nature from the enslaved population. He was the enforcer, the one who would drag victims to the barn when Van der Berg's refined sensibilities prevented him from doing the dirty work himself. But Hendricks brought more than just muscle to their partnership. He had an intuitive understanding of human psychology that complemented Van Der Berg's more intellectual approach to torture. While Van Der Berg planned elaborate psychological torments, Hendricks specialized in reading his victims' breaking points, knowing exactly when to escalate or reduce pressure for maximum effect. The two men had developed an almost telepathic working relationship, able to coordinate their cruelty without explicit communication. Hendricks also served as Van Der Berg's early warning system, using his network of informants among the enslaved population to identify potential troublemakers before they could organize resistance. His presence was essential to maintaining the climate of terror that kept other slaves from intervening or reporting the atrocities they witnessed. Without Hendricks, Van Der Berg's operation would have collapsed under its own brutality. I want you to picture the faces of the forgotten, men, women, and children whose names were never recorded in any official document, whose humanity was denied even as they endured unimaginable suffering. These weren't just numbers in Van Der Berg's ledger. They were individuals with dreams, families, and an unbreakable will to survive that their tormentors could never fully crush. There was Kwame, a skilled blacksmith who had been captured from the Gold Coast, and whose knowledge of metalworking made him valuable enough to keep alive despite his repeated escape attempts. His wife, Amma, worked in the main house and bore the additional burden of Van Der Berg's sexual violence, forced to endure his assaults while maintaining the pretense of domestic service. Their daughter, barely 8 years old, had already learned to make herself invisible when the master's eyes turned her way. There was old Samuel, a man who had survived the Middle Passage and 20 years of bondage, whose stories of African freedom inspired hope in younger slaves, while marking him for special punishment. These victims weren't chosen randomly. Van Der Berg targeted those with the strongest spirits, the natural leaders who might organize resistance if left unchecked. He understood that breaking exceptional individuals would demoralize the entire enslaved population, creating a contagion of despair that made rebellion seem impossible. Each victim represented a different aspect of human resilience that Van Der Berg sought to destroy: parental love, cultural memory, spiritual faith, and the basic belief in their own worth as human beings. But in focusing so intently on crushing these spirits, Van Der Berg made a fatal error. He underestimated the one slave who was studying him just as intensely as he studied his victims. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because the man who would ultimately destroy Van Der Berg wasn't supposed to witness the master's crimes at all. Caesar had been purchased as a house slave, specifically because of his literacy and intelligence, qualities that made him valuable for managing correspondence and basic bookkeeping. Van Der Berg believed that giving Caesar privileged access to the main house would create loyalty, making him complicit in the system that elevated him above field slaves. For 3 years, Caesar played this role perfectly, maintaining the facade of the grateful, domesticated servant while carefully observing every aspect of Van Der Berg's operation. The turning point came on a humid August night in 1737 when Caesar was returning late from an errand in town and heard screams coming from the barn. Curiosity and concern for his fellow slaves compelled him to investigate, and what he discovered through a gap in the barn's wooden walls changed him forever. Van Der Berg and Hendricks were torturing Kwame, the blacksmith, using techniques so brutal and prolonged that Caesar initially couldn't process what he was seeing. But as the hours passed and the torture continued, Caesar realized he was witnessing something far more systematic than occasional punishment. This was entertainment for his master, a carefully orchestrated ritual of sadism that Van Der Berg savored like fine wine. The most horrifying aspect wasn't just the physical brutality, but Van Der Berg's obvious sexual arousal and intellectual fascination with his victim's psychological breakdown. Caesar watched until dawn, documenting every detail in his memory, understanding that he had discovered the true nature of the man who owned his life. In that moment, he made a decision that would consume the next 4 years of his existence. Van Der Berg had to pay for his crimes, and Caesar would be the instrument of that justice. Now, you have to understand what witnessing that level of systematic cruelty does to a human mind, especially when you're powerless to stop it. Caesar returned to the main house that morning fundamentally changed, carrying the weight of knowledge that he couldn't share with anyone without risking immediate execution. The psychological trauma of watching Kwame's torture, knowing that he could be next, that any of them could be next, triggered a profound transformation in Caesar's personality. He became hypervigilant, analyzing every interaction with Van Der Berg for signs of suspicion or threat. Sleep became elusive as nightmares replayed the barn's horrors, and he found himself jumping at unexpected sounds, constantly anticipating the summons that would drag him to his own destruction. But perhaps the most agonizing aspect was his forced complicity in maintaining Van Der Berg's public facade. Caesar had to serve tea to visitors while they praised his master's Christian virtue, had to smile and nod when Van Der Berg spoke about treating his servants with kindness. The cognitive dissonance nearly drove him to madness. How could he function normally when he knew the truth about the monster he served? When Caesar tentatively approached other house slaves about strange sounds from the barn, he was met with fearful denial and warnings to mind his own business. Even those who suspected the truth were too terrified to acknowledge it, knowing that knowledge itself was dangerous. This conspiracy of silence, born from desperate self-preservation, isolated Caesar completely and forced him to bear his terrible burden alone. But isolation also bred determination. If he couldn't save the others through confession or flight, he would have to find another way to stop Van Der Berg's reign of terror. The colonial authorities had perfected the art of willful blindness when it came to plantation atrocities, and Van Der Berg's operation was no exception to this systemic corruption. When concerned citizens or visiting clergy occasionally raised questions about conditions on his property, local officials would launch cursory investigations designed to fail from the start. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, a longtime friend and business partner of Van Der Berg, would arrive with advance warning, allowing time for any evidence to be hidden and witnesses to be coached or intimidated into silence. These investigations followed a predictable script. Whitmore would tour the main facilities during daylight hours, interview a handful of carefully selected slaves who had been threatened into compliance, and produce reports that praised Van Der Berg's management practices. The barn, of course, was always off-limits during these visits, dismissed as a simple storage facility that contained nothing of interest to investigators. When physical evidence of abuse became impossible to ignore, slaves with obvious torture wounds or suspicious deaths, the official reports would cite agricultural accidents, tribal violence among the enslaved population, or the natural consequences of their primitive nature. The colonial legal system was structured to protect property owners like Van Der Berg, and enslaved people had no legal standing to testify against their masters, even if they had been brave enough to try. Whitmore understood that his job wasn't to uncover the truth, but to maintain social stability by ensuring that the comfortable fiction of benevolent slavery remained intact. This institutional protection gave Van Der Berg complete confidence in his impunity, never imagining that justice might come from within his own household rather than from the corrupted official system. Let's be real, the most damning evidence of Van Der Berg's systematic cruelty was walking around his plantation every day, bearing the physical and psychological scars of his attention. Slaves who had survived sessions in the barn were fundamentally changed, their personalities shattered and rebuilt around the trauma they had endured. Kwame, once a proud craftsman who took pleasure in his metalworking skills, became a hollow shell who flinched at unexpected movements and spoke in whispers when he spoke at all. His expertise with tools, ironically, the very skills that had made him valuable enough to keep alive, now filled him with visible dread whenever he was required to work with iron. Amma developed a nervous tic, constantly touching her throat where rope burns had left permanent marks, and her once bright eyes now held the flat, lifeless stare of someone whose spirit had been methodically crushed. Other survivors exhibited different symptoms. Some became hypervigilant and paranoid. Others withdrew into catatonic states, and a few developed what we might now recognize as dissociative disorders, their minds fracturing under pressures no human psyche was designed to withstand. Van Der Berg actually took pride in these transformations, viewing them as proof of his psychological expertise and the effectiveness of his methods. He would point out specific behavioral changes to Hendricks, like an artist admiring his masterpiece, discussing the techniques that had produced each result. But while Van der Berg saw these broken individuals as testaments to his power, Caesar recognized them as evidence of crimes so heinous that they demanded the ultimate punishment. Each damaged soul walking Van der Berg's plantation was another reason why the master's eventual reckoning needed to be as complete and terrible as the suffering he had inflicted. I want you to picture this, because what Caesar discovered through careful observation was that Van der Berg's cruelty wasn't random or impulsive, but followed a systematic methodology that he had refined over years of practice. Van der Berg approached torture with the same intellectual rigor that other men applied to business or scholarship, maintaining detailed records of what techniques produced which results, how long different individuals could endure specific punishments, and what psychological triggers were most effective for breaking particular personality types. He had developed a classification system for his victims, categorizing them by age, physical condition, cultural background, and psychological resilience, then tailoring his approach accordingly. Young slaves received different treatment than old ones, parents were tortured differently than childless individuals, and those who showed leadership qualities faced specialized techniques designed to destroy their influence over others. Van der Berg's records, which Caesar would later discover hidden in the barn's secret compartment, read like a perverted medical journal, documenting the progression of psychological breakdown with clinical detachment. He had even developed what he called maintenance protocols, regular sessions designed to prevent slaves from recovering their mental equilibrium between major punishments. The most chilling aspect of this system was its efficiency. Van der Berg had calculated exactly how much suffering he could inflict without rendering his victims completely useless for work, maximizing both his sadistic pleasure and his economic returns. This wasn't madness or passion. It was evil applied with scientific precision, a methodical study in human destruction that revealed the true depths of Van der Berg's moral corruption. Understanding this system would prove crucial to Caesar's eventual revenge, as he learned to anticipate his master's methods and prepare countermeasures years in advance. Now, you have to understand that Caesar wasn't born a hero. He was forged into one by circumstances that would have broken lesser men. At 32, he possessed a rare combination of intelligence, patience, and moral clarity that made him uniquely suited for the impossible task of bringing justice to an unjust world. Born in bondage to educated parents who had secretly taught him to read and write, Caesar understood that knowledge was power, even for those who society considered powerless. His literacy made him valuable to Van der Berg, but it also gave him tools that other slaves lacked: the ability to gather information, understand legal documents, and plan complex operations that required written records. But Caesar's greatest asset wasn't his intelligence. It was his profound empathy for his fellow sufferers and his unshakable belief that even the most powerful men could be held accountable for their crimes. Unlike other slaves who dreamed of escape, Caesar had concluded that running away would only allow Van der Berg to continue torturing others. His conscience wouldn't permit him to save himself while leaving behind those who lacked his advantages. This moral conviction transformed what could have been a simple revenge plot into something far more significant: a carefully orchestrated campaign to expose and punish evil at its source. Caesar understood that he was probably signing his own death warrant by targeting Van der Berg, but he had reached the point where living with the knowledge of unpunished atrocities was worse than the risk of dying while trying to stop them. He wasn't seeking personal freedom. He was seeking justice for every soul that Van der Berg had tortured, and that made him far more dangerous than any ordinary rebel. Over the next 4 years, Caesar conducted the most dangerous undercover investigation in colonial history, gathering evidence while maintaining his facade as the loyal house slave. His position gave him unprecedented access to Van der Berg's correspondence, financial records, and personal papers, documents that revealed the true scope of his master's crimes. Caesar discovered that Van der Berg was part of a network of like-minded plantation owners who traded information about torture techniques and occasionally shared victims for special occasions. The man wasn't just a lone sadist. He was part of a systematic culture of cruelty that infected multiple plantations throughout the Hudson Valley. Using his access to the main house, Caesar secretly copied sections of Van der Berg's journals, documenting dates, victims' names, and detailed descriptions of specific tortures. He developed a photographic memory for conversations between Van der Berg and his collaborators, memorizing every boast about successful disciplinary sessions and every plan for future atrocities. Caesar also began conducting his own psychological study of his target, learning Van der Berg's patterns, triggers, and weaknesses with the same methodical approach that his master applied to torture. He discovered that Van der Berg was deeply narcissistic and craved recognition for his expertise, often inviting Hendricks and visiting accomplices to observe his work. This need for an audience would later prove crucial to Caesar's plan. Most importantly, Caesar began documenting the physical layout of the barn, mapping every chain, identifying every tool, and understanding the building's structural weaknesses. He was planning something unprecedented, not just an assassination, but a complete reversal of the power dynamic that would force Van der Berg to experience the same helplessness and terror that he had inflicted on others. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where the careful planning gives way to execution, where 7 years of patient investigation culminates in the most audacious act of poetic justice in American history. I need you to steel yourself for what's coming, because Caesar's revenge wasn't quick or merciful. It was designed to be a perfect mirror of Van der Berg's own methods, a reversal so complete and terrible that it would haunt the colonial consciousness for generations. This isn't just about one slave's rebellion anymore. It's about the moment when evil met its precise equal, when the predator became the prey, and when justice wore the face of vengeance. If you're still with us, if you have the stomach to witness what happens when the powerless seize ultimate power, then stay tuned. But remember, you asked for the truth about what really happened in the shadows of colonial America. Comment below if you're ready for the climax, and share this video if you think others deserve to know how the story ends. Because what Caesar did to Van der Berg that night will challenge everything you think you know about justice, revenge, and the human capacity for both cruelty and retribution. This is Echoes of Truth, and we're about to uncover the most shocking conclusion you've ever heard. The moment that sealed Van der Berg's fate came in the spring of 1741, when Caesar discovered the master's most carefully guarded secret, a hidden compartment in the barn containing detailed records of every torture session, sketches of his victims' suffering, and correspondence with other plantation owners about sharing disciplinary techniques. Van der Berg had been keeping these records as both trophies and reference materials, documenting his crimes with the pride of a collector cataloging rare artifacts. The papers revealed the full scope of his sadism. Lists of victims organized by the type of suffering inflicted, detailed anatomical drawings showing the progression of torture wounds, and even financial calculations determining the economic cost of damaged slaves versus the psychological satisfaction of their punishment. But the most damning evidence was a series of letters between Van der Berg and plantation owners in Virginia, South Carolina, and the Caribbean, discussing the formation of what they called the Brotherhood of Discipline, a secret society dedicated to perfecting the art of human torture. These men were treating enslaved people as experimental subjects in their study of pain, sharing techniques and victims like scientists, collaborating on research. Caesar realized that he wasn't just dealing with one monster, but with an entire network of sadists who had turned cruelty into a refined art form. The discovery filled him with both rage and determination. Van der Berg's crimes were even worse than he had imagined, and the evidence in that hidden compartment would ensure that the world would eventually know the truth. But first, Caesar had to survive long enough to expose it, and that meant accelerating his timeline for revenge. Van der Berg's arrogance in keeping such detailed records would ultimately prove to be his downfall, providing Caesar with everything he needed to justify the terrible justice he was planning. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Van Der Berg discovered Caesar in the barn that night, hidden compartment open, damning evidence scattered across the floor like accusations made manifest. The confrontation that followed wasn't the swift violence you might expect, but a tense psychological duel between master and slave, predator and prey, each man suddenly seeing the other's true nature with perfect clarity. Van Der Berg's first reaction wasn't anger, but admiration. He actually praised Caesar's intelligence and thoroughness, treating the discovery like a chess match where he had finally found a worthy opponent. "You've been studying me," Van Der Berg said with genuine pleasure, "just as I've been studying others." How delightfully ironic. But Caesar wasn't there for conversation. He was there for justice, and he had prepared for this moment with the same meticulous planning that Van Der Berg applied to his tortures. The chase that followed was unlike anything in colonial records, a cat-and-mouse game through the dark plantation grounds where the traditional roles of hunter and hunted began to reverse. Van Der Berg, for the first time in his life, experienced genuine fear as he realized that Caesar knew every hiding place, every escape route, every tactical advantage on the property. Caesar had spent 4 years mapping the plantation's geography, identifying weak points in buildings, and understanding the patterns of guards and overseers. When Van Der Berg reached for his pistol, he found that Caesar had already removed the powder. When he tried to summon help, he discovered that Caesar had disabled the bell system. Every advantage that Van Der Berg had counted on was already neutralized by his former victim's superior preparation. The hunter was becoming the hunted, and for the first time, Van Der Berg understood what helplessness truly meant. Now, you have to understand that Caesar's plan was never simple assassination. That would have been too quick, too merciful for a man who had spent years perfecting the art of prolonged suffering. When Caesar finally cornered Van Der Berg near the barn, the master expected a quick death, perhaps even welcomed it as preferable to the legal consequences of his exposed crimes. Instead, Caesar produced the chains that Van Der Berg had used on countless victims, the same iron shackles that had restrained men, women, and children during their final agonizing hours. "You're going to experience everything you've given others," Caesar announced with calm certainty, "starting with the chains, then the barn, then the fire. But first, you're going to confess." The reversal was complete and terrible. Van Der Berg, who had always controlled the timing and intensity of others' suffering, now faced the prospect of enduring his own methods applied with the same methodical precision he had always employed. Caesar forced Van Der Berg into the barn at gunpoint, but not before making him read aloud from his own journals, reciting the details of every torture session, every victim's name, every calculated cruelty he had inflicted. The psychological impact was devastating. Van Der Berg was forced to confront the full scope of his crimes in his own voice, hearing the catalog of his evil echoing off the barn walls where so many had suffered. Caesar had learned from his master's techniques. He understood that physical pain was only half of effective torture, and that psychological breakdown was the true art. By making Van Der Berg condemn himself with his own words, Caesar was applying the same intellectual approach to suffering that his master had pioneered. The predator was experiencing what all his victims had felt, the helpless certainty of approaching doom combined with the psychological torture of anticipation. Let's be real. When the authorities finally arrived at the Van Der Berg plantation the next morning, responding to reports of smoke and screaming, they discovered a scene that challenged their understanding of human nature itself. The barn was still smoldering when Sheriff Whitmore and his deputies broke down the door, expecting to find the aftermath of a typical slave rebellion, quick violence followed by flight. Instead, they found Van Der Berg chained to the same restraint system he had used on his victims, his body bearing the precise marks of his own torture devices, applied with surgical precision over what the coroner later estimated was a 6-hour period. Caesar had recreated every technique that Van Der Berg had perfected, following the master's own journals as a how-to guide for revenge. But the physical evidence was only part of the horror that confronted the authorities. Scattered throughout the barn were Van Der Berg's records, his correspondence with other plantation owners, sketches of torture sessions, and detailed financial calculations about the cost of human suffering. The hidden compartment yielded even more damning evidence: preserved body parts from previous victims, tools specifically designed for human torture, and a library of books on anatomy and psychology that Van Der Berg had consulted to perfect his techniques. Sheriff Whitmore, who had spent years covering up Van Der Berg's crimes, found himself staring at evidence so overwhelming and horrific that even his corrupted conscience couldn't process it. The barn wasn't just a murder scene. It was an archive of systematic evil that documented decades of unpunished atrocities. Caesar had turned Van Der Berg's own pride in documentation against him, using the master's meticulous record-keeping to create an undeniable indictment of his crimes. I want you to picture the moment when Van Der Berg's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath the surface of colonial respectability. The man who had been praised by clergy and respected by merchants stood exposed as something far worse than a common murderer. He was a systematic destroyer of human souls who had turned torture into both art and science. The correspondence found in the barn revealed his connections to at least 12 other plantation owners across the colonies, all members of his Brotherhood of Discipline, who shared techniques and victims like scholars exchanging academic papers. These weren't isolated cases of cruelty. They represented a coordinated network of sadists who had turned the institution of slavery into their personal laboratory for studying human suffering. Van Der Berg's personal history, as revealed through his journals and letters, showed a progression from childhood cruelty to animals, through adolescent violence against servants, to the refined sadism of his adult years. He had always been a monster, but slavery had given him the legal framework and social permission to indulge his darkest impulses without consequences. Willem Hendricks, the overseer, was revealed to be more than just a collaborator. He was Van Der Berg's protege, trained in the master's methods and preparing to establish his own torture operation on a plantation in South Carolina. The network extended beyond individual plantations to include corrupt officials, complicit doctors, and even certain clergy members who had been paid to ignore evidence of systematic abuse. Van Der Berg wasn't just a criminal. He was the center of a web of corruption that infected colonial society at multiple levels, protected by institutional racism and economic interests that valued property rights over human rights. Now, you have to understand that what Caesar had uncovered wasn't just a local atrocity. It was evidence of an international conspiracy that stretched from colonial America to the Caribbean, South America, and back to Europe itself. Van Der Berg's correspondence revealed connections to slave traders in Liverpool, plantation owners in Barbados, and even certain members of the Dutch colonial administration who had helped establish protocols for managing enslaved populations. The Brotherhood of Discipline was far more organized and extensive than anyone had imagined, with members sharing not just torture techniques but also enslaved people themselves, trading victims like livestock when they wanted to experiment with new forms of suffering. Financial records showed that Van Der Berg and his associates had created a parallel economy based on human misery, charging each other for access to specialized torture facilities and expert consultations on breaking resistant spirits. They had turned cruelty into a profitable business, complete with standardized procedures, quality assessments, and performance metrics. Some members of the network held respected positions in colonial society: judges, merchants, even government officials, who used their authority to protect the conspiracy and silence anyone who threatened to expose it. The scope of the crimes was staggering. Thousands of enslaved people had been subjected to systematic torture across multiple plantations over decades, their suffering documented and shared like research data. Caesar's discovery of this network transformed his personal quest for revenge into something much larger. He had uncovered evidence of crimes against humanity that demanded international attention and justice. The barn fire hadn't just destroyed one monster. It had illuminated an entire system of institutionalized evil that infected colonial society from top to bottom. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Because the most horrifying discovery wasn't Van der Berg's crimes themselves, but how many people had known about them and chosen to remain silent. In the weeks following Caesar's revenge, as investigators dug deeper into the evidence, they uncovered a conspiracy of willful ignorance that infected colonial society from the ground up. Church records showed that multiple clergy members had received anonymous reports about screams coming from Van der Berg's plantation, yet none had ever conducted serious investigations. Local doctors had treated suspicious injuries on enslaved people for years, documenting obvious torture wounds as agricultural accidents without asking uncomfortable questions. Even neighbors who lived close enough to hear the screams had convinced themselves that the sounds were normal parts of plantation discipline, too afraid of social ostracism to challenge a respected member of their community. The colonial press, which had occasionally run glowing profiles of Van der Berg's progressive management techniques, now faced the uncomfortable truth that they had been complicit in promoting a monster. But perhaps the most damaging revelation was the extent of official corruption. Sheriff Whitmore wasn't the only law enforcement officer who had taken bribes to ignore Van der Berg's crimes. The conspiracy of silence extended to judges, magistrates, and even colonial governors who had been paid to ensure that certain investigations never proceeded. Society had created a perfect environment for Van der Berg's atrocities by establishing unwritten rules that protected wealthy white men from accountability, especially when their victims were enslaved people whose testimony had no legal standing. The silence wasn't passive ignorance. It was active collaboration, a conscious choice to prioritize social stability over human justice. Caesar's revenge had shattered this conspiracy by making the truth impossible to ignore, but the cost of that silence, measured in decades of unpunished suffering, would haunt the colonial consciousness for generations. Now you have to understand that Caesar's story didn't end with Van der Berg's death. In fact, that was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape colonial justice forever. Caesar himself was never captured, despite the largest manhunt in colonial history. Some say he escaped to Canada, others believe he joined a maroon community in the Appalachian Mountains, but the truth is that he simply vanished like smoke, leaving behind only his terrible legacy of perfect justice. The authorities, faced with overwhelming evidence of Van der Berg's crimes, found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't prosecute a dead man, but they also couldn't ignore the evidence of systematic torture that Caesar had forced into the light. Willem Hendricks, the overseer, was arrested and executed within a month, becoming the scapegoat for crimes that extended far beyond his individual actions. But the real reckoning came for the Brotherhood of Discipline. Caesar's evidence led to raids on 12 other plantations across the colonies, exposing a network of torture chambers that shocked even hardened investigators. 3 plantation owners were executed, 5 were imprisoned, and 4 fled to Europe rather than face colonial justice. Sheriff Whitmore was stripped of his position and died in poverty, his reputation destroyed by revelations of his complicity in covering up decades of atrocities. The corrupt doctors and officials who had enabled Van der Berg's operation faced varying fates. Some were prosecuted, others simply disappeared from public life, their careers and reputations ruined by association with the scandal. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the transformation of Caesar himself from slave to legend. He became a folk hero among enslaved communities throughout the colonies, proof that even the most powerful oppressors could be held accountable by those the I sought to destroy. His methodical approach to revenge inspired other enslaved people to document their masters' crimes, creating an underground network of witnesses who would eventually contribute to the abolition movement decades later. Let's be real, Caesar's revenge changed the fundamental dynamics of slavery in colonial America, even though the institution itself would persist for another century. The systematic documentation of Van der Berg's crimes created an undeniable record of the horrors that slavery enabled, evidence that could never be dismissed or explained away by those who profited from human bondage. The case became a touchstone for early abolitionists, who used Van der Berg's journals and correspondence as proof that slavery inevitably corrupted both the enslaved and their masters. creating environments where the worst aspects of human nature could flourish without consequence. But the legacy extended beyond the abolition movement. Caesar's methodical approach to justice demonstrated that enslaved people possessed the same capacity for complex planning, moral reasoning, and strategic thinking that white society denied them. His revenge wasn't the impulsive violence that colonial propaganda attributed to enslaved people, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that required years of patience, investigation, and psychological insight. The case forced colonial society to confront an uncomfortable truth. If enslaved people were capable of such sophisticated planning and execution, then the entire justification for slavery, that Africans were intellectually inferior and needed white guidance, was exposed as a self-serving lie. The moral lesson of Caesar's story is both simple and profound. Systematic evil creates its own destruction by teaching its victims the very methods that will ultimately be used against it. Van der Berg's mistake was believing that his intelligence and social position made him invulnerable, never realizing that he was training his own nemesis with every atrocity he committed. Caesar learned patience from enduring years of powerlessness, strategic thinking from observing his master's methods, and moral clarity from witnessing unpunished evil. In trying to break Caesar's spirit, Van der Berg actually forged it into an instrument of perfect justice that would ultimately destroy not just him, but the entire network of corruption that had enabled his crimes. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? As you sit in the comfort of your modern world, ask yourself this haunting question. How many contemporary monsters are hiding behind facades of respectability, protected by networks of willful ignorance and institutional corruption? Caesar's story isn't just historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when society chooses comfort over justice, when we look away from suffering because confronting it would be inconvenient or dangerous. The same psychological dynamics that enabled Van der Berg's crimes exist today in different forms. The tendency to believe that respected figures couldn't possibly be monsters. The willingness to explain away evidence that challenges our comfortable assumptions, and the institutional structures that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Caesar succeeded because he understood that documentation is power, that patience can overcome privilege, and that evil ultimately destroys itself by creating the very conditions that will lead to its exposure. His methodical approach to justice offers a template for holding the powerful accountable, even when official systems fail to protect the innocent. If this story has disturbed you, good, it should. If it's made you question your own assumptions about justice, power, and moral courage, even better. Subscribe to Echoes of Truth and join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let history's darkest secrets remain buried. Comment below with your thoughts on Caesar's methods. Was his revenge justified, or did he become the very monster he sought to destroy? Share this video with others who need to understand that the line between victim and avenger is often thinner than we imagine. Next week, we'll explore another case where the powerless seized ultimate power. The story of a French housemaid who brought down an entire royal conspiracy through nothing but patience, observation, and perfectly timed revelation. The truth is always more terrifying than fiction, and we're just getting started.